Welcome to the podcast of All Means All. In this episode, Hermione Xin Miao, Akshita Rawat, and Lynam will talk about bridging learning and teaching, some pathways to inclusive education.
Hi everyone, my name is Lynam and I'm a qualified primary school teacher. I'm also involved in international school training in the Netherlands, where we train student teachers to work in international schools across the world. My interests lie in creating context for students to collaborate, to problem solve together, all the while collaborating in a very helpful fashion. I also have a lot of interest in meditation, in mindfulness, and of course inclusive education, which is why we're here today. Before we start, I would like you to reflect on a question. So based on your school experience, what opportunities did you have to work on social issues and investigate together with your peer students?
Hi, my name is Akshita Rawat and I have a background in sociology and sociology of education, and I'm interested in understanding questions of inequality in education. And my interest in education comes from my own schooling experiences in India, where they followed a more lecture-based and authoritative model. And when I started rethinking it later in my university years, I started to learn that education and schools can also be emancipatory while at the same time oppressive. And it brings me to my interest on the ways we can change schools, and we can make schools different and make them more inclusive. And for today, I would like you to think about the question that what are the challenges and benefits do you think are there when you try to bring in more diverse perspectives into your learning and teaching methods?
Yeah, it's really interesting when you mention about we can make a difference, we can change it. And for me, I changed my given name to the agentic name I really like called Hermione. So I choose to call myself Hermione. It is related to the character I really like. She pointed out that house elves shouldn't just provide free services to witches and the wizards, but before that no one pointed it out. And she pointed out that house elves, they are magical animals. It's based in Harry Potter stories. They are magical animals. They provide free services and no one think about their welfare at all. And she started society to promote their welfare. And that, when I read that, I like, okay, so actually we can change something. We don't have to accept because it has been there for ages, because it's tradition, so we just accept it. So I changed my given name and also start to reflect my experience. I experienced very traditional teacher education, and I still remember sometimes my struggles. That's why partly why I stepped into study teacher education, and I can see that it doesn't have to be this traditional way for you. We can make it teacher education more inclusive for you and for the future generations. Apart from my research dedication in teacher education, teacher agency, and the interplay with agency and structure, curriculum making and curriculum making as social practices, I also really like maps. I like drawing maps, lesson to stories. That's why I started an initiative called Mapping Inspirational Women, in which I collect the stories, but also put these stories based on the meaningful locations. And the question I want you to think about when we are going through with learning and teaching methods is that, in your case, what difference would be made if learning and teaching methods are designed to foster cross-cultural understanding and make educational scenarios more inclusive?
Nice, thanks Hermione. Okay, so here together today, so maybe we can talk about how we think learning and teaching can relate to inclusive education, and in doing so, what we mean by learning and teaching.
I would like you to think about a scenario and the society we live in, that there are so many issues based on race and gender and class and religion, and these are the things that affect all of us. And because we are not, we don't exist unattached from the world, and neither do our schools or classrooms. They don't exist in a vacuum. So after a point, we start thinking that why are these things happening, and who has been benefiting from it, or what are the factors behind it. So this is where critical pedagogy begins, that you start to think and reflect on your own lives, and you also at the same time believe in the possibility that you can transform it. So this brings me to Paulo Freire, who talks about critical pedagogy, and he was one of the important figures who laid down its foundations and contributed to developing it. And he talks about it, he refers to it as praxis, as reflection and action. So we can think about it as a action-based critical approach to education. So that's what critical pedagogy is about. And it doesn't just talk about theory, it's not just about thinking about these abstract ideas, and it starts from something concrete. So students start from their own lives, from their own lived experiences, and it helps them to move from something which is commonsensical to something which is more analytical and more critical and more theoretical. And the good thing about, or the thing about, or the essence of critical pedagogy is that it's not prescriptive. There's no one way of doing it. It's not a method that you can just take and adapt in your classroom and you'll achieve it in one day. It's about a perspective and an approach which is very, can be made and remade by the teachers and students together.
The process, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a long process. It's not, you can't, it's about your entire learning experience and educational years, and you develop this perspective where you think about things in their larger context. And it's also about the teachers, that teachers play a really important role. It's about, it helps tackle a lot of prejudices or biases that we could have as teachers or as students. And it's about the teachers, also about the teachers' subjectivity. So of course there are a lot of challenges, and we have to acknowledge that for a teacher there are several challenges when trying to work in an institutional setup. And they have to follow a curriculum, they have deadlines, and they have certain limitations, but they also have their own subjectivity. And so critical pedagogy, because it is interactional, it creates a space where you can also question your own biases and prejudices. And often we see that teachers also rely on use this lens of meritocracy. So it allows us to engage with that and also question that.
What do you mean by meritocracy in this aspect? Can you just maybe elaborate more?
So usually, even in our own schooling years, or even we thought at some point in our lives when we were younger, or at some point, that if you work hard, you will succeed. So it takes this lens or perspective that all of us sort of start at an equal level. And when we enter the schools, all of us just start at the same level, and if we study hard, and those who are not studying hard, it's their problem and they are not able to succeed or take advantage of the opportunities. So critical pedagogy, because it's an interactional space, it creates the possibility where we can question these prejudices, because there are several levels of disadvantage and privilege. We have our own identities. We could be disadvantaged in any way, whether based on our abilities or we could belong to a minority group. So there are these disadvantages and advantages that all of us have, which affect and also enter the classroom.
I remember when we were talking about critical pedagogy, you used a term called learn and unlearn, and also about when you talk about how disadvantage become advantage in certain area. Like for me here, if I speak Chinese, no one would understand. But if I go back to China, I speak Chinese became an advantage because people can understand what I'm talking about. It's also really based on different contexts. And I think that's why, like in our learning and teaching method chapter, we invite readers to co-create a wheel of privilege and power for you to check where you come from. Because meritocracy creates a fallacy that we're all equal, born equal, but we actually have different background, different things, especially when you're in different contexts. That's something you need to think about before you take the moves. And I really like to talk about with the reflection and action. Yeah,
we have a different starting point, and our students have different starting points.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Like the inquiry-based learning. I mean, I was interested to read everything and listen to everything you said about critical pedagogy, because I can definitely see a lot of links between inquiry-based learning and that. I can see that the commonalities being student engagement, investigating problems, the collaboration side of things, giving students ownership. it could be good to maybe reverse a little bit and just think about where it came from. So inquiry-based learning would have been based on the foundations of the work of John Dewey and Piaget as well, in terms of experiential learning, investigating, problem solving, active engagement with the local environment. And obviously since then, many educators and theorists have brought things further, and I would say it's like a precise instructional tool that teachers can use in the classroom in order to give their students like an opportunity to really investigate problems. They're obviously guided in this process too, but essentially investigating, researching, finding out more, and trying to problem solve together, and ultimately draw conclusions and bring about change in the world, a positive change in their communities and the local, national and global context. How to do this in the classroom is obviously can be complex at times. I have looked into the work of Trevor Mackenzie, of Kath Murdoch too. There's an inquiry cycle that's very useful in the classroom too, like a structured process the students can go through. You want to ask a question?
So I was just curious, because you both talk about critical and inquiry-based learning. I'm so curious how it's like in the classroom, but I'll let you to finish and then ask some examples.
Yeah, I would say it's similar, because in this inquiry cycle, for students to tune in, they find out more and they go further. But there's definitely a big part when they're obviously reflecting a lot in this whole process too. And they're asking the questions. Even the very first stage of the inquiry cycle, I've done this thing like Wonderwall. The students are, especially in primary, like they're really just getting to grips with these topics for the first time. And they're thinking of questions, and they're given the opportunity to really investigate themselves, guided by the teacher with questions that will be appropriate to their level. But then they really take ownership of their learning, and the learning becomes very meaningful for them. They take a lot of ownership. There's also different levels of inquiry. So Trevor Mackenzie talks about a control inquiry, structured inquiry, eventually to open inquiry, like a continuum. Here's a nice image. If you imagine a swimming pool, there's a shallow end and a deep end. Maybe initially the teachers are with their students in the shallow end. They're really guiding them, maybe even modeling a lot. But eventually want our students to get to this other deep end, when they're able to use this process for themselves, to really investigate and even create their own assessments and learning, understanding learning outcomes and intentions. So it doesn't just happen straight away. I think there's a false misconception that inquiry-based learning is just letting your students play and inquire, but really as teachers we have to kind of guide them in that process too. Does that kind of answer your question?
But I would like to know, because I know you used to teach, right? I want to know some classroom example, like something I still remember. But I also want to know what Akshita, like how you make critical pedagogy happen in the classroom. Although it's not a one-day thing, but is there something small that teachers can start to make a change?
Okay. Okay. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, what you said about this misconception about inquiry-based learning, I think that's something that even comes up in critical pedagogy, that we think that teachers don't have any role and teachers can just take a back seat and they're absent, but education is directive and teachers do hold expert knowledge. So we do want to acknowledge that as well. And it's about the teachers, they are also learning and relearning and unlearning in this process along with the students. So I'll give you an example, and before that I would like to emphasize something that critical pedagogy places a lot of emphasis on dialogue. So when I say dialogue, I don't mean that it's a technique or a method which will give one kind of outcome. It's more about a process that enables you to think about your own lived experiences and your own concrete, start from what you see in your life and begin from something really concrete. And this makes me think of an example that I read in one of the interviews of Paulo Freire, where he talks about a teacher. So the teacher tells their students that they're trying to teach them physics, and they tell them that I want you to go back to your neighborhood and your home and talk to people in your neighborhood, or people who are also, they live in a fishing community. So they ask them to talk to people who are fishers and ask them questions about what do you think when you look up in the sky? What do you think about why do we experience day and light, about the stars, and these several questions, and write down the answers. And the next day the students come to the classroom and they have this different answers, and because every person has their own way of understanding, or a community has or depending on your surrounding or your own socialization processes, that you have your own way of understanding. So this also makes them think of and analyze their own ways of understanding and ways of knowing. So now the role of the teacher is to make them think more scientifically and bring it and connect it to the scientific knowledge.